Does anybody remember the TV show Chips?
Of course.
Okay. Well, if there's anyone who doesn't, Chips was about the California Highway Patrol, that's CHP. And back in the days when it was on, they didn't have TV shows with just initials, so they had to throw in a vowel. And I've always maintained that they use the I because the snack food industry buys more advertising time than the pork producers. But I could be wrong about that. In any event, when the show was on the air, my younger son turned 7. And that year for Halloween, we asked him, what do you want to be for Halloween? And Danny said, Chips. So I thought, well, it's a popular show. I'll go find a costume. I went off to the stores. And I couldn't find a Chips costume anywhere. I did find a mask. So actually, a highway patrol costume was not that big a deal. You get a khaki shirt, and you put a little badge on it, and you're there. You know, that's all. So, but this was not for going door to door trick-or-treating. At that time, we lived in the little town of Warwick, New York, which is right on top of New Jersey. And they had an annual Halloween parade down the streets, down Main Street with all the kids. And you can't have a motorcycle policeman going down the street without a motorcycle. That was what I thought.
Oh.
So I didn't have the money or the inclination to buy the kid a mini bike. And so I went in the garage and looked around, found a big cardboard box that was about as long as he was tall. And I turned it inside out, ripped off the flaps, and proceeded to draw a motorcycle on either side with the rider from the waist down, so that way he could hold it. When I started doing that, I kind of flashed back to the afternoon when I owned a motorcycle, because I needed a model. And at that time, I was a freshman in college. My family lived in Clemson, South Carolina, and I started my college career in the university of the same name. And a friend I had from high school, who was also with me in college, called me up one day and he said, on the bulletin board, there's an ad for a motorcycle for $75. And I said, well, all right. He read the description to me, which didn't mean anything to me. And I said, if it runs, we ought to be able to flip it. Because the kids on campus, they're sort of stuck with the campus. But us commuters, we had the whole county to work with. So that Saturday, he calls me back. Well, before he got off the phone, we had to work it out. I had the money. So I would buy the bike, and we would keep it at his house. This way, he could tell his father that he didn't buy the motorcycle. It was mine. And I didn't have to tell my father anything. So Saturday morning, he calls me up. The seller has brought the bike over to his house. I get in the car, I drive over. And I don't know if you've ever seen a 1946 Harley Davidson, but it is a monster. Biggest motorcycle I'd ever seen. Painted flat black. And I walked around it. It didn't seem to have any rust or any visible damage. And the seller gets over there, he gives it a kick, and it started right up. Now that's good enough for me. I got the money. And but then he said, don't you want to ride it? And my friend was no help at all. He said, yeah, you ought to give it a test drive. I had never driven a motorcycle before. I had ridden on the back of a couple, but that's not the same thing. So I thought, well, the motor's running, and he's right, I really ought to try it. So I threw a leg over the saddle, and I sat there, and the seller came around, and he told me about how it worked. And please pay attention here, there'll be tests later. The gas is on the right handlebar, the brake is on the left, the gear shift is like the stick shift in a car, and moves like that, and that's on the tank, and then the clutch is under the left foot. And before I started, he said, now it sticks a little between first and second, but other than that, it runs fine. Okay. So I go out the driveway, turn left onto the street, and at that point, I noticed there were two things that were immediately apparent. One was that my friend lived on a hill, and the street had a downward curve to it. The other thing was that the apex of the curve was a man who lived for his lawn. It was absolutely gorgeous. This was a different shade of green than all the other lawns. The blades of grass were as even and dense as the fibers in a Persian carpet. People would drive down the street and slow down to look at that lawn. And you know where the story's going. So I started going down the street. And I didn't have to give it much gas because we're going downhill. But because we're going downhill, the motor starts to race. Okay, I've got to shift gears. I put down the clutch, put it into second. It doesn't go into second. So I tried putting it into third, but it didn't seem to catch in third. So I went back down to go into second. And I'm there holding back on the gas and working the gear shift and the clutch. And I'm sort of in neutral going downhill. And does anyone know which control I'm not controlling? Yeah, where were you then? Anyway, at that point, another feature of the bike became apparent, and that was the knee guard, which was a chrome pipe. With that pipe, that knee guard, I plowed about a 12-foot trench in the man's yard. The handlebar cut a parallel slash almost that far before it turned into a pretzel. And the kickstand had a minor gash like that before it snapped off the bike altogether. Well, our friends came running down the hill, and we looked around and realized that the man who owned the house wasn't at home. And we figured it would be easier for him to patch the lawn than for us to explain. So we grabbed the bike and pushed it back up. By the time we got back up the hill, I had decided that I was not cut out to be a biker. I returned the motorcycle and paid for repairs. So now as I'm drawing the cardboard box, remember this is the story of Danny in the Halloween parade? I'm drawing the box, and this is still kind of haunting me in the back of my head. Then brought out Danny, put him in the box, shoulder straps. He walked around the driveway a little bit. That worked fine. So why couldn't he do 6 or 7 blocks? So the next day we go out and we start down the way. And I have to give my son credit. As he started out, I went with him, except I walked on the other side of the street to give him his space. I realized that was probably a fairly heavy box for a boy his size to carry 6 or 7 blocks. And because it was balanced on his shoulders, it would tip this way and that. If it went forward, of course, he'd stop very suddenly. And if it went back, he could lose control. So he had to grip it, both sides, very firmly. And I couldn't see his little face, but he never turned his head. He stayed looking straight ahead. He didn't stop, he didn't complain. So I had to give him a lot of credit. I earned a lot of respect there. Now, as we went in the parade, you have to know that the town of Warwick, being on top of New Jersey like that, it's a popular area. It's not on the main highway for a lot of motorcycle groups to come up through there to see the fall colors. And every weekend we would get a bunch of them. And the only hotel in town was a seedy-looking place across the street from the train station. Now, as we're approaching the train tracks to cross over, I look over at the hotel, and parked in front are about a half dozen large motorcycles. And up on the sidewalk, watching the parade, are a group of people with vests and t-shirts and tattoos and long hair and beards and that sort of thing. And I'm watching them, and I realize they may not be fans of the California Highway Patrol. And if they were going to make rude comments to my son, how was I supposed to react to that? I didn't have time to figure out a plan of action, though, because about that time Danny got into their field of view, and I'm watching them, and smiles broke out on their faces. They were just delighted, and they're nudging each other and calling to their friends who weren't watching and pointing. And at that moment, I kind of felt I'd sort of redeemed myself in the world of motorcycling, because even though I couldn't ride with them, at least I could do something that they appreciated. But that's not the takeaway from this. The major lesson from this didn't come until years later, when we realized that after walking with that heavy box, from that day until the time when he married and moved away, Danny never once said he wanted to own a motorcycle.